My relatives said we were the family of failures, then they learned that I was a doctor. My dad drove a bus for 30 years, and my mom cleaned office buildings at night. We lived in a small apartment while my cousins lived in huge houses because their parents were all lawyers and business owners. Every family reunion was the same thing. Uncle Harold would ask Dad if he was still driving that bus like it was something shameful. Aunt Rita would tell Mom about her new designer purse while Mom sat there in her Target clearance clothes. Cousin Bradley would talk about his acceptance to Yale while looking at my brother and me like we were headed straight to community college. They'd always make these comments about how some people were meant for bigger things and others had to accept their station in life. My parents never fought back, just smiled and said they were proud of their honest work. But I saw how Dad's shoulders would drop when Uncle Harold talked about his latest promotion. I watched Mom's face when Aunt Rita would accidentally forget to invite us to the fancy family events because we wouldn't fit in with their important friends. When I was applying to colleges, the whole family laughed when I said I wanted to be a doctor. Cousin Bradley actually said out loud that people like us didn't become doctors. We became patients. Aunt Rita patted my mom's hand and said it was sweet that I had dreams, but I should be realistic about my abilities. Uncle Harold offered to get me a job at his company in the mailroom when I inevitably dropped out. They didn't know I'd already gotten a full-ride scholarship to a state school based on my grades. I didn't tell them either. For 8 years, I disappeared from family events. Told my parents to say I was working, which was true. I was working my way through pre-med, then medical school, then residency. 80-hour weeks, living on vending machine coffee, studying until my eyes burned. My parents knew what I was doing, but I made them promise not to tell anyone. They'd ask why, and I'd say I wanted to focus without the family's negative energy. Really, I was planning something better. During those 8 years, the relatives got worse. They'd ask my parents if I'd dropped out yet. When my brother became an electrician, they said at least one of us learned a trade instead of chasing impossible dreams. They started excluding my parents from more events, saying it was too expensive and they'd understand since money was tight for bus drivers. Uncle Harold loved telling the story about how he'd offered me a mailroom job, and I was too proud to take it, probably why I was failing now. Cousin Bradley became a financial advisor and made sure everyone knew he was managing portfolios worth millions, while my family couldn't even manage to show up to reunions. They actually started a family group chat without us, where they planned vacations and shared success stories. Mom found out from a family friend and cried for days. Then came Grandma's 90th birthday party, big fancy event at a hotel ballroom that Uncle Harold paid for. He made sure everyone knew he'd covered everything, because that's what successful family members do for those they love. My parents were put at a table in the back corner with the family friends. No one really knew. I showed up late, straight from a 36-hour shift, still in my scrubs because I didn't have time to change. Uncle Harold saw me first and loudly said, "Look who finally showed up dressed like a janitor." Aunt Rita asked if I was working at a hospital now, and before I could answer, she said at least cleaning work was steady employment. Bradley made a joke about how I must have finally taken that mailroom job, but at a hospital instead. The whole room was laughing. That's when the hotel manager approached, asking if there was a doctor present because someone in the lobby was having chest pains. The relatives kept laughing about their jokes while I followed the manager out. Turned out to be a mild panic attack, but I stayed with the man until the ambulance arrived, doing the full assessment to be safe. The manager was so grateful that he announced to the whole ballroom that they were lucky to have such a skilled emergency physician in attendance. "Doctor," Rivera called me, using the title and last name from my hospital badge. The room went silent. Uncle Harold asked what the manager meant by doctor. The manager explained I'd just provided emergency care, and he'd looked me up, and I was actually the head of emergency medicine at the biggest trauma center in the state, the youngest department head in the hospital's history. Aunt Rita laughed nervously and said there must be a mistake because I was just, and then she stopped because she couldn't say what she'd been about to say. I walked back to the microphone they'd set up for speeches and introduced myself properly for the first time in 8 years. I lifted the microphone and tapped it twice. The feedback screech cut through the murmurs and made everyone turn toward me. My voice came out steady even though my heart was pounding, so hard I could feel it in my throat. I said I wanted to properly introduce myself since it had been 8 years. I told them I was Dr. Rivera, head of emergency medicine at State Trauma Center. I explained that while they all assumed I'd failed and dropped out, I'd actually been completing medical school and residency. The ballroom went completely silent except for Grandma's oxygen tank humming in the corner. Uncle's face turned red, starting at his neck and spreading up to his forehead. Aunt's mouth hung open like she'd forgotten how to close it. I could see her expensive lipstick smudged on her bottom teeth. Several relatives had stopped mid-bite, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the ice melting in someone's drink at a nearby table. I kept talking, my voice calm and even. I explained that 8 years ago I'd received a full-ride scholarship to state school based on my grades. That's why I could afford medical school despite my parents' modest income. I watched Cousin's face change as I spoke. His smug smile faded first, then his eyes got wider, then something like panic crossed his features. His whole body went stiff in his chair. I could see him gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His entire story about me failing was collapsing right in front of everyone, and he knew it. His wife touched his arm, but he didn't seem to notice. A few relatives near him shifted in their seats, glancing between him and me. I turned toward the back corner where Mom and Dad sat. I thanked them publicly for teaching me the value of honest work and perseverance. I said that watching Dad drive that bus with pride for 30 years taught me more about serving people than any fancy school ever could. I told them that Mom's dedication to cleaning those offices with integrity showed me what real character looked like. Mom's face crumpled and tears started running down her cheeks. Dad put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. Both of them looked completely overwhelmed. Dad's eyes were shining and he kept blinking fast like he was trying not to cry too. Mom pressed her hand over her mouth, but I could see her shoulders shaking. Several people at their table reached over to touch their arms or pat their hands. Uncle tried to interrupt with a forced laugh that came out too loud and too high. He stood up halfway and said this was wonderful news, and he always knew I had potential. But his voice cracked on the word potential, and it came out sounding strangled. Several relatives turned to stare at him with new expressions on their faces. The skepticism was obvious. People who'd been nodding along with his comments about me for years were now looking at him like they were seeing him differently. Aunt clutched her designer purse against her chest, like it might somehow protect her from all the judgment now pointing her direction. She kept looking around at the other tables, trying to make eye contact with people, but most of them looked away. The shift in the room was almost physical, like the air pressure had changed. I set the microphone back in its stand and walked across the ballroom to my parents' table. My scrubs made a soft swishing sound with each step. Mom and Dad both stood up before I got there. Mom grabbed me first and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Dad wrapped his arms around both of us. His voice was rough when he whispered that he was so proud. Then he pulled back a little and asked why I didn't tell them I was coming tonight. I admitted I wanted to see the looks on everyone's faces when they realized they'd been wrong about me for 8 years. Dad let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Mom kissed my cheek and her tears were wet against my skin. The party atmosphere had completely changed. Small groups of relatives were whispering and glancing between our table and Uncle's prominent seat near Grandma. Some people were pretending to eat, but their eyes kept darting over. Others had given up pretending and were just staring openly. Several cousins I barely knew started approaching our table. They came one at a time or in pairs, moving slowly like they weren't sure if they should. Their congratulations felt forced and uncomfortable. One cousin said she always thought I'd do something great. Another said he'd been meaning to reach out over the years. A third asked what medical school was like with this fake enthusiasm that made my teeth hurt. All of them had either ignored me completely at past events or laughed along with Uncle's jokes. Now they were acting like we'd always been close. I kept my responses short and polite, but I didn't pretend I believed their sudden interest was real. Grandma's voice cut through the noise. She called my name and waved me over to her table. When I got close, she reached out and grabbed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone 90 years old. Her fingers were bony but warm. She pulled me down so I had to lean closer to hear her. She said she was proud of me, but wished I'd shared my journey with the family instead of hiding it. Her eyes were watery behind her glasses. I realized as she spoke that she genuinely didn't understand. She had no idea how toxic her children had made things for my parents. She thought I'd just been busy with school. She thought the family had been supportive and I'd chosen to stay away for no good reason. The confusion on her face was real. I spent 20 minutes sitting next to Grandma, explaining as gently as I could. I told her I stayed away because every family event became a chance for her children to make my parents feel small. I described how Uncle would ask Dad about the bus like it was shameful. How Aunt would talk about designer purses while Mom sat there in clearance clothes. How Cousin made it clear he thought people like us couldn't become doctors. Grandma's face changed as I talked. She looked troubled, her forehead creasing deeper with each example. She admitted she'd noticed some tension between her children, but thought it was just normal sibling stuff. She said siblings always compete and tease each other. I shook my head and told her this went way beyond that. I explained about the family group chat that deliberately excluded my parents. About the events they weren't invited to because we wouldn't fit in. About 8 years of constant comments about my failure that my parents had to endure alone. Grandma's hand tightened on mine, and she looked toward Uncle's table with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Uncle appeared next to us with Aunt right behind him. Both of them were doing obvious damage control. Uncle's businessman smile was back, but it looked painted on. He insisted they were just joking all these years and never meant any harm. Aunt nodded along and said everyone knew they were just teasing. Her voice was too bright and too fast. I looked at them calmly and asked if they thought it was a joke when they were excluded my parents from the family group chat. I asked if forgetting to invite them to important events because we wouldn't fit in with their successful friends were just teasing. Uncle's smile flickered. Aunt started to say something but stopped. Several relatives at nearby tables had gone quiet and were clearly listening now. Aunt's face flushed deep red, and she stammered that those were just oversights. She said things got busy and sometimes people got left off invitation lists by accident. I pulled out my phone without saying anything. I scrolled to the folder where I'd saved screenshots Mom had sent me over the years. I turned the screen toward them and started swiping through images. Family vacation photos from trips my parents never knew about until afterward. Birthday celebration announcements that my parents learned about from other relatives weeks later. Holiday gatherings they weren't invited to. Summer barbecues at Uncle's house that somehow their invitation got lost. I watched Uncle's confident businessman face crack as he realized what he was looking at. His eyes moved from the phone to my face and back again. Aunt made a small sound in her throat. The relatives who were listening weren't even pretending not to stare anymore. Uncle's whole carefully built image of the generous, successful brother was falling apart right there in the hotel ballroom. I stepped away from them before either could come up with another excuse. The crowd had thinned around us, but enough relatives remained nearby to witness the whole exchange. I walked through the ballroom toward the exit, passing tables where family members pretended not to stare while clearly hanging on every word they'd overheard. My hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, not from anger, but from finally saying what I'd rehearsed in my head for 8 years. The hotel carpet muffled my footsteps as I headed toward the lobby, needing space to breathe after confronting the people who'd made my parents feel worthless for decades. My brother caught up with me near the coat check area. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled me into a hug that nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. When he finally let go, his eyes were wet, and he was grinning like he'd just won something important. He told me he'd been waiting 8 years to watch someone put Uncle and Aunt in their place like that. I started to apologize for keeping him out of the loop, but he cut me off and admitted Mom had told him about medical school during my second year because she needed someone to talk to about how proud and worried she was. He'd respected my request to stay quiet, even though he wanted to brag about his doctor brother every time Cousin made another snide comment about our family's lack of ambition. We found a quiet corner near the hotel bar and sat down on one of those fancy couches that's more for show than comfort. For the next hour, we talked about things we'd never really discussed before. He explained that becoming an electrician wasn't just about finding steady work. It was partly his way of refusing to play the family's game, where your worth got measured by how impressive your job title sounded. He made good money, better than Cousin actually earned after you factored in all the insurance products Cousin pushed on people who didn't need them. But the family treated his skilled trade like it was something to apologize for, while acting like Cousin's financial advisor job was some kind of achievement. He'd watched me disappear from family events and understood why, even wished sometimes he had the guts to do the same thing instead of showing up, and enduring their comments about how at least one of us learned a practical skill instead of chasing impossible dreams. The party was winding down when we walked back into the ballroom. Several relatives approached us separately over the next 30 minutes. An aunt I barely remembered hugged me and said she'd always believed in me, which was strange considering she'd never spoken to me before tonight. She asked if I was accepting new patients because her husband needed a good doctor. A cousin whose name I couldn't recall wanted to know if I could help his son get into medical school, maybe write a recommendation letter or make some calls to admissions offices. Another relative asked if I knew any specialists because her sister needed a referral, and it would be so helpful to have a doctor in the family. I realized none of them were actually confronting what had happened tonight, or acknowledging the years of cruelty my parents endured. They just wanted to be associated with my success now that it was public and useful to them. Mom and Dad found me near the exit. Mom's eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. Dad had his arm around her shoulders and looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. They insisted I come back to their apartment instead of driving home to my condo across the city. I tried to argue that it was late and they must be exhausted, but Mom squeezed my hand and said she wasn't ready to say goodnight yet. During the drive, Dad stayed quiet behind the wheel while Mom kept holding my hand in the back seat. The car felt full of 8 years of complicated feelings. Pride mixed with relief, mixed with leftover hurt, mixed with something that felt like sadness for all the time we'd lost while I was hiding my achievements, and they were defending my absence to relatives who assumed I'd failed. Their apartment looked exactly the same as it had 8 years ago. Same worn couch, same kitchen table with the wobbly leg Dad kept meaning to fix, same family photos on the wall that stopped including me after I disappeared from gatherings. We sat at that kitchen table where I'd studied for the MCATS, where Mom used to quiz me on anatomy terms before her night shift cleaning offices. She made coffee even though it was past midnight. We finally talked honestly about the 8 years of silence. Mom admitted she understood why I needed to disappear from family events, but she'd missed me desperately at holidays and birthdays. She'd wanted to tell Uncle where I really was every time he made another joke about my failure. Dad said watching Uncle mock my absence while not knowing I was succeeding had been one of the hardest things he'd endured in 30 years of enduring Uncle's condescension. I apologized for making them carry the secret alone. I explained that I'd been so focused on proving everyone wrong that I didn't fully consider how my absence affected them beyond sparing them from more family judgment. I'd thought about the big reveal for so long that I'd forgotten about all the small moments they'd faced alone. Dad reached across the table and grabbed my hand. He said he'd do it again because seeing Uncle's face tonight was worth 8 years of snide comments. We all started laughing, and then somehow we were crying, and then we were laughing again until our stomachs hurt, and the coffee got cold. Over the next few days, my phone exploded with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Some texts felt genuine, congratulating me on my achievements and apologizing for not staying in touch. Others were so transparent I almost laughed. Distant cousins suddenly remembered we'd been close as kids. Aunts and uncles wanted to grab lunch and catch up. Everyone seemed to have a story about how they'd always known I'd do something special. Cousin sent a long text apologizing for his behavior over the years and asking if we could get coffee to talk things through. I read it twice, then put my phone down without responding. I wasn't ready to let him off the hook that easily. His apology might be sincere, but 8 years of mockery didn't disappear because of one text message sent after he got embarrassed in front of the whole family. Uncle called my dad directly 4 days after the party. Dad answered and immediately put him on speaker so I could hear from across their living room. Uncle's apology lasted 10 minutes and was full of justifications. He talked about how competitive he'd always felt with his younger brother, how Dad's contentment with a modest life made him feel like his own ambition was judged, how seeing Dad happy driving a bus while Uncle stressed over quarterly earnings reports made him question his own choices, how he'd needed to feel superior to his brother to justify the sacrifices he'd made for his career. I listened to the whole thing and realized he was still making this about himself rather than the pain he'd caused. He was explaining his behavior instead of truly owning it. When he finally stopped talking, Dad was quiet for a long moment before saying he'd think about what Uncle said and they could talk again later. After he hung up, Dad looked at me and shook his head. Aunt sent a gift basket to my parents' apartment 3 days later. It arrived in a huge wicker basket wrapped in cellophane, filled with expensive cheeses and fancy crackers and imported chocolates and bottles of wine that probably cost more than my parents spent on groceries in a month. The card was thick and embossed with gold lettering. Inside, Aunt had written a long message expressing regret for any misunderstandings over the years and hoping we could move forward as a family. Mom read the card twice, then set it aside and started unpacking the basket. She pointed out that Aunt was apologizing through money and gifts rather than actually examining her behavior. The expensive foods were easier than honest conversation. We loaded everything into bags and drove it to a shelter downtown. Mom kept the basket for storage, saying at least something useful came from Aunt's guilt. Monday morning arrived with my alarm going off at 5:30, same as always. I drove to the hospital through empty streets, the city still dark and quiet. The parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, just a few night shift cars scattered across the levels. I badged into the emergency department and headed straight for the staff lounge to drop off my lunch. The break room was busier than usual for 6 in the morning, with at least a dozen people clustered around the coffee maker and the small table where someone always left donuts. The conversation stopped the second I walked through the door. Everyone turned to look at me and I felt my face getting hot. Ricardo was standing near the window holding a coffee mug, and he raised it toward me like a toast. He told everyone that the hospital board member who attended Grandma's party had already spread the story through 3 departments, and by now half the hospital knew about the family drama. I wanted to disappear into the floor. One of the night shift nurses came over and touched my arm, saying her own sister hadn't spoken to her in 5 years because she became a nurse while her sister stayed in their small town working retail. She said families sometimes couldn't handle when one person climbed higher than they expected. A respiratory therapist shared that his father still introduced him as his son, who works at the hospital, never mentioning that he had a master's degree and ran the entire respiratory department. An attending physician admitted that her mother still asked when she was going to get a real job, even though she'd been practicing medicine for 12 years. The stories kept coming, each person adding their own experience of family members who diminished their success or couldn't celebrate their achievements. I stood there holding my empty lunch bag, realizing I wasn't alone in this specific kind of hurt. The conversation shifted back to normal work topics after about 15 minutes, but something had changed. These colleagues I'd worked alongside for years suddenly felt more like actual friends who understood something important about my life. My pager went off at 6:15, pulling me into the organized chaos of the emergency department. The morning moved fast with the usual stream of patients having chest pain, breathing problems, injuries from overnight accidents. I was in the middle of examining a patient with possible appendicitis when the overhead page system called my name, asking me to report to administration. My stomach dropped. The hospital administrator never called department heads to her office unless something was seriously wrong. I finished with my patient, handed off to the attending covering my cases, and took the elevator up to the third floor where the administrative offices lived in their quiet, carpeted world, far from the emergency department noise. Peggy's assistant waved me straight into her office. She was sitting behind her desk looking at her computer screen, and she gestured for me to close the door and sit down. I lowered myself into the chair across from her desk, my mind racing through every possible professional conduct violation I might have committed. She turned away from her computer and looked at me directly. She asked if I was worried about getting in trouble, and I admitted that showing up at a family party in my scrubs and making a scene probably wasn't the most professional choice. She laughed and said she didn't care about any of that. She grew up in a trailer park with a single mom who cleaned houses, and she was the first person in her entire extended family to go to college. Her relatives treated her scholarship to state school like she'd won the lottery through dumb luck, rather than 4 years of perfect grades. She told me about her aunt who said college was wasted on girls who'd just get married anyway, and her uncle who asked why she needed a degree when she could make decent money waitressing. She worked her way through undergraduate and then got her master's in the hospital administration, while her cousins posted on social media about how she thought she was too good for the family now. When she got her first administrator job, her own sister stopped inviting her to family events because she made everyone else feel bad about themselves just by existing. I sat there listening, surprised that this woman who always seemed so polished and professional had experienced the same kind of family rejection. She leaned back in her chair and said she hadn't spoken to most of her siblings in 15 years because they couldn't handle her success. Every achievement became another wedge between them. When she got promoted to the hospital administrator, her brother sent her a message saying she'd become exactly the kind of person they used to make fun of when they were kids. She warned me that my big revelation at the party might not lead to the reconciliation I was hoping for. Some people were too invested in their story about themselves being superior to admit they'd been wrong. They'd rather lose the relationship than face their own behavior. She said I might need to accept that some family relationships were permanently broken, and that wasn't my fault or my responsibility to fix. I thanked her for sharing her experience and left her office feeling heavier than when I'd arrived. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of patience and paperwork. I drove home around 7 that evening, exhausted from the long day and the emotional weight of multiple conversations about family dysfunction. I had an appointment with Valeria at 8, and I barely had time to change clothes and grab something to eat before heading back out. Her office was in a small building near the university, up a flight of stairs to a waiting room with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to make people feel calm. I'd been seeing her since my second year of residency, when the 80-hour weeks and constant stress started giving me panic attacks. She opened her door right at 8 and invited me in. We settled into our usual spots, her in the chair by the window and me on the couch against the wall. She asked how I was feeling about the party, and I told her the whole story from start to finish. She listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes on her tablet. When I finished, she asked what I'd been hoping to achieve with the public revelation. I started to answer, then stopped because I realized I'd never actually examined my motivations that clearly. She pushed me to think about whether I wanted vindication, revenge, or something else entirely. We spent the next 40 minutes digging into what I'd really wanted from that moment at the microphone. Through the conversation, I realized I'd wanted my parents to be publicly recognized as good people who raised a successful son despite their modest means. I wanted everyone who'd watched Uncle and Aunt make my parents feel small to see that their judgment was wrong. I wanted the relatives who'd excluded my parents from family events to feel ashamed in front of everyone. Valeria asked if the revelation had achieved those goals. I admitted that it had, at least in the moment. She asked if the satisfaction felt as good as I'd imagined during 8 years of planning. I sat with that question for a long time before answering. The moment had felt powerful, standing at that microphone and watching their faces change from mockery to shock. But it also felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. Uncle and Aunt's embarrassment didn't undo the years they'd made my parents feel inferior. The family dynamics hadn't fundamentally changed. They'd just shifted to accommodate my new status, and that felt like a superficial victory rather than genuine growth or healing. Valeria nodded like she'd expected this answer. She pointed out that revenge fantasies rarely delivered the satisfaction we imagined because they didn't actually repair the underlying damage. I'd proven them wrong, but that didn't make my parents' hurt disappear or transform my relatives into better people. I left her office feeling emotionally wrung out, but also clearer about what had actually happened at that party. I drove home through dark streets, thinking about everything Peggy and Valeria had said. My phone rang as I was unlocking my apartment door. My brother's name showed on the screen. He sounded tired when I answered. He told me the family group chat I'd never been included in had exploded with drama over the past few days. Apparently, they'd added him to it right after the party, and he was getting dozens of messages every day. Some relatives were defending uncle and aunt, saying everyone was being too hard on them, and they'd just been joking around all those years. Other relatives were sharing their own experiences of being judged or excluded by the family. One cousin admitted she'd felt looked down on for years because she'd gone to community college instead of a 4-year school. An aunt confessed that she'd stopped coming to family events because aunt always made comments about her weight. My brother said the whole thing was exhausting to watch. People were performing concern and solidarity that they'd never shown when it actually mattered. Everyone wanted credit for being supportive now, but where were they when Mom found out about the group chat and cried for days? Where were they when Uncle told that mailroom story for the 100th time? He said he was considering muting the chat because watching everyone rewrite history to make themselves look better was making him angry. We talked for another 20 minutes about how people were suddenly acting like they'd always been on our side, and then we said goodnight. I fell asleep thinking about Peggy's warning that some relationships might be permanently damaged. The week passed in a blur of work and avoiding my phone, which kept buzzing with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. I responded to a few of the ones that seemed genuine and ignored the rest. Friday afternoon during my lunch break, one of the emergency department clerks told me someone was asking for me in the waiting room. I walked out expecting a patient or maybe a pharmaceutical rep, but instead I found Cousin standing near the registration desk, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. He asked if we could talk, and I agreed to meet him in the cafeteria. We got coffee and found a table in the corner away from other people. He looked genuinely nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup and not making eye contact. He started by saying his entire identity had been built on being the family success story. Yale, the finance job, the nice apartment, the whole package. My revelation at the party had forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding for years. He was coasting on his Yale degree while working a job he found completely meaningless. He spent his days selling financial products to rich people who didn't need them, and he went home every night feeling empty. Watching me stand up there and talk about my actual passion for medicine made him realize he'd never felt passionate about anything in his career. He'd chosen finance because it paid well and impressed people, not because he cared about it. He apologized for his specific comments about people like us not becoming doctors. He admitted he'd been threatened by my ambition because it highlighted his own lack of passion. If I could become a doctor despite coming from a family of bus drivers and cleaners, what was his excuse for settling into a career that made him miserable? I appreciated the honesty, and I told him so. But I also told him that understanding why he was cruel didn't immediately erase the impact of his cruelty. He'd spent years making me and my parents feel inferior, and those wounds didn't heal just because he'd had an epiphany about his own life choices. Rebuilding trust would take time and consistent changed behavior, not just one honest conversation. He nodded and said he understood. He asked if we could maybe try to have coffee again in a few weeks, and I said maybe. He left looking both relieved and disappointed, and I went back to work. 2 days later, my dad called to say Uncle had requested a meeting with him, Mom, and me. We agreed to meet at a neutral restaurant rather than anyone's home, choosing a quiet place near my parents' apartment. Uncle arrived 10 minutes early, and I watched him through the restaurant window as we walked up. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders less straight and his face showing stress lines I didn't remember. His usual commanding presence was replaced by something that looked almost like humility. We sat down at a table near the back, and the server brought water and menus. Uncle didn't open his menu, just sat there looking at his hands. He started talking without looking up. His voice came out quiet and rough, like he'd been practicing what to say, but the words still hurt coming out. He apologized to my parents for 30 years of putting them down and making them feel less than him. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He told Dad that their father, my grandfather, who died before I was born, always favored Dad, even though Harold was the one with big plans and ambition. Grandpa would brag about Dad's honest work driving the bus and how he was a good man who treated people right, but he barely mentioned Harold's business success. Harold said he spent his whole adult life trying to prove he was worth more than his younger brother by making more money and having a bigger house and a fancier life. He thought if he could show everyone how successful he was, maybe it would make up for never being the favorite son. Dad sat very still while Harold talked, and I watched my father's face go through about 10 different emotions. When Harold finally stopped talking and looked up, Dad's jaw was tight. He said he never knew Harold felt that way about Grandpa's attention. He never realized their father made Harold feel second best. But then Dad's voice got harder, and he said that still doesn't excuse 30 years of making his wife and children feel like garbage. 30 years of comments about the bus driving job. 30 years of Aunt treating Mom like she was too poor and too simple to matter. 30 years of laughing at me for wanting to be a doctor. Harold's face went red and he nodded fast, saying Dad was right and asking what he could do to fix things now. Dad leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He said Harold couldn't fix 30 years with one apology and some explanation about childhood. What he needed was to show changed behavior over time, not make big promises or grand gestures that would fade out in a few weeks. He said he'd believe Harold was different when he saw it happen consistently, not because Harold said it would happen. Harold looked like Dad had punched him, but he agreed. The server came by to take our order and we all just asked for coffee, nobody wanting to eat during this conversation. I spoke up after the server left. I told Harold that the family group chat he made without my parents needed to be completely dissolved and replaced with a new one that included everyone, or he needed to publicly tell the whole family that he deliberately left people out and commit to including everyone going forward. Harold's face went pale and his hands gripped the edge of the table. He looked at me and then at my parents and then down at his coffee cup. I realized right then that giving up control over how the family communicated and who got were included was genuinely hard for him. He'd been the one deciding who mattered and who got left out for, so long that letting go of that power felt like losing something important. But he said okay. He said he'd do it. 3 days later, Mom got a text from Aunt asking to meet for coffee. Mom showed me the message and asked what I thought she should do. I told her it was her choice, but that Aunt probably wanted to apologize now that Harold had. Mom agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near their apartment. I offered to come along for support, but Mom said she needed to do this alone. She met Aunt on a Thursday morning and came home 2 hours later looking exhausted. She sat down at the kitchen table and told me and Dad what happened. Aunt had cried through most of the conversation. She apologized for years of being cruel, both the obvious mean comments and the subtle ways she made Mom feel less important. She admitted she felt bad about her own background and covered it up by acting like her current wealth and status made her better than everyone else. Aunt grew up poor too, poorer than my parents, and she married Harold partly because his family had money. She spent years trying to prove she belonged in that world by putting down anyone who reminded her of where she came from. Mom was that reminder. Every time Aunt saw Mom in clearance store clothes or heard about Dad's bus route, it made her think about the life she'd escaped and the person she used to be. Mom told Aunt that she accepted the apology, but needed time to trust that the change was real. She said she wasn't interested in suddenly being part of Aunt's social circle, now that I was successful, and made the family look good. If Aunt wanted to rebuild their relationship, it had to be because she genuinely valued Mom as a person, not because having a doctor in the family made her look better to her rich friends. Aunt looked hurt when Mom said that, but she was accepted it. Mom came home feeling completely drained, but said there was something in Aunt's eyes that seemed genuine. She wasn't sure if the remorse would last, but at least Aunt was trying. The next afternoon, my phone rang with Grandma's number. She asked me to visit her at her retirement community because she needed to talk about family dynamics she'd been blind to for too long. I drove over that evening after my shift ended. When I got to her apartment, she had photos and old cards and party invitations spread across her dining table. She said she wanted me to help her understand when and how things got so bad in the family. We sat down and started going through everything. I pointed out patterns she'd never noticed before. In every family photo from the last 20 years, Harold and Aunt were positioned prominently in the center or front, while my parents were stuck in corners or the back row. Birthday cards showed that Harold and Aunt's kids got long personal messages from relatives, while my brother and I got generic one-line notes. Party invitations revealed that my parents were invited to big events at the last minute, while everyone else got weeks of advance notice. I showed her how achievements were celebrated completely differently, depending on who accomplished them. When Cousin got into Yale, the whole family threw a party, and Harold sent an announcement to everyone he knew. When I got my scholarship, nobody outside my immediate family even knew about it. Grandma started crying as we went through decades of family history. She said she let Harold pay for everything and run all the family gatherings because it seemed easier than dealing with conflict. She never questioned why some family members stopped coming to events, or why my parents always seemed quiet and uncomfortable. She just assumed everyone was fine because nobody complained directly to her. She apologized for not protecting my parents and asked if it was too late to change how the family worked. I told her honestly that some damage can't be fully repaired. The years of hurt don't just disappear because people finally admit they were wrong. But acknowledgement matters and effort matters, even if things never go back to how they could have been. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small shifts. Relatives who used to walk right past my parents at gatherings now stopped to actually talk to them and ask real questions about their lives. The family group chat got deleted, and a new one appeared with everyone included, even family members who'd been left out for years. Harold's usual dominance at family events was less obvious. He still talked a lot and had opinions about everything, but he asked other people what they thought instead of just announcing decisions. The changes felt shaky and sometimes fake, like people were performing being better rather than actually being better. But they were still changes. My brother called me one Saturday and asked if I wanted to grab lunch. We met at a place halfway between our apartments and spent 2 hours talking about everything happening with the family. He admitted he was struggling with anger about how people suddenly treated our parents better only because I became a doctor. He said Mom and Dad deserved respect all along for being good people who worked hard and raised their kids right, not just because one of those kids achieved something impressive that made the family look good. I agreed with him completely. The fact that it took my success to make people treat our parents decently said everything about how shallow those relationships were. I suggested that maybe some people genuinely didn't realize how their behavior affected others until someone made it clear. Not everyone who participates in toxic family dynamics is consciously cruel. Some are just thoughtlessly following established patterns until someone disrupts them. My brother considered this but still looked unconvinced. He said intention doesn't erase impact, and I agreed with that too. We sat in silence for a while, both processing how complicated forgiveness becomes when you're dealing with years of accumulated hurt from people who claim they didn't know better. 2 weeks later, Godwin took me to lunch at a small restaurant near the hospital. He'd been my residency mentor 5 years ago, and we'd stayed in touch even after I finished training. He ordered coffee and asked how I was handling the family situation, and I gave him the short version of everything that happened since the party. Godwin nodded slowly and said he'd been through something similar when he became a physician. He came from a working-class background like mine. His dad worked construction, and his mom was a secretary. When he got into medical school, his siblings reacted with resentment instead of pride. They felt he was abandoning his roots by pursuing medicine. They made comments about how he thought he was better than them now. They stopped inviting him to family gatherings because they said he wouldn't want to hang out with regular people anymore. Godwin tried for years to maintain those relationships, but the resentment ran too deep. His brother told him that doctors were all greedy and didn't care about real people. His sister said he'd changed and wasn't the same person she grew up with. Eventually, he had to accept that some family relationships couldn't be salvaged. The gap was too wide, and they weren't willing to meet him halfway. He built chosen family with colleagues and friends instead. People who supported him and understood his journey. He told me he was sharing this because he wanted me to remain open to reconciliation where possible, but not to sacrifice my peace trying to fix relationships with people who weren't willing to do their own work. Some relatives might genuinely change and grow. Others might just perform change to avoid looking bad. I needed to protect myself while giving people the chance to prove themselves through actions over time. 3 months after the party, my parents hosted a small dinner at their apartment. Just my brother, his girlfriend, me, and them. No extended family, no drama, no competition. Mom made her famous chicken casserole, and Dad grilled vegetables on their tiny balcony grill. We sat around the same kitchen table where I'd studied for the MCATS years ago. The apartment felt warm and comfortable in a way family gatherings at hotels and fancy restaurants never did. Dad raised his water glass and said this was what family should feel like. People who genuinely love and support each other without competition or comparison. He was grateful that the 4 of us had always had this even when the extended family was toxic. My brother's girlfriend looked a little emotional, and she mentioned that her own family was complicated too. She appreciated being included in something that felt real and safe. We spent 3 hours eating and talking and laughing about nothing important. Mom told embarrassing stories about my brother and me as kids. Dad shared memories from his bus driving days, the regular passengers who became friends over the years. My brother talked about a complex electrical job he'd just finished and how proud he was of solving a problem that had stumped other electricians. I shared a story about a patient who came into the emergency room convinced he was dying, but turned out to have really bad gas. We were just being ourselves without worrying about judgment or keeping score. After dinner, Mom brought out coffee and announced she had news. She was retiring from her cleaning job. She'd worked nights for 30 years and was finally eligible for pension. She wanted to spend her remaining healthy years enjoying life, rather than working while everyone else slept. Dad added that he was considering early retirement from the bus company, too. They'd been talking about traveling to places they'd always dreamed about, but couldn't afford or didn't have time for. Mom wanted to see the Grand Canyon. Dad wanted to visit national parks out west. They had a whole list of places they'd been planning for years. I offered to help financially with their retirement plans. Dad's face shifted and he said no immediately. He didn't want my success to become about money. He and Mom had always supported themselves and didn't need charity now. I understood his pride, but explained that helping them enjoy retirement wasn't charity. It was gratitude for the sacrifices they made raising my brother and me. They worked multiple jobs to keep us fed and housed. They supported my education even when the rest of the family mocked my ambitions. They carried the secret of my medical career for 8 years while enduring constant questions about whether I'd failed. Letting me contribute to their travel fund wasn't about me being successful. It was about me being their son and wanting them to be happy. Mom started crying and Dad's jaw tightened. They looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that couples have after decades together. Finally, Dad nodded and said they'd accept help with the travel fund, but nothing else. They'd still pay their own bills and handle their own expenses. The travel money would be a gift from their son who wanted to give back. I agreed to those terms, and Mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. A week later, Cousin reached out again through text. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee and talk. I'd ignored his previous messages because I wasn't ready to let him off the hook. But something about this message felt different. Less performative, more genuine. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop halfway between our places. He showed up looking tired and less polished than usual. His expensive suit was replaced with jeans and a regular shirt. He ordered black coffee and we sat outside where it was quiet. He told me he'd been seeing a therapist to work through his identity crisis. The revelation at the party forced him to confront that his entire sense of self was built on being the family's success story. My achievement shattered that narrative and left him questioning everything. He admitted he was considering leaving financial advising to pursue teaching. That was his original passion before family pressure pushed him toward a more lucrative career. Uncle had convinced him that teaching was a waste of his intelligence and that financial advising would make him wealthy and respected. He'd spent 10 years managing portfolios and selling insurance products to rich people, and he was miserable. He made good money but felt empty. He apologized again for his behavior over the years and said he understood if I couldn't forgive him. He just wanted me to know he was trying to change. I appreciated his honesty and decided to share some of my own struggles. During medical school, I questioned whether I was pursuing medicine for the right reasons or just to prove my family wrong. There were nights when I almost quit because the motivation felt corrupt. I had to work through that with my own therapist and figure out that my reasons could be complicated. I could want to help people and also want to prove Uncle wrong. Both things could be true. I encouraged Cousin to explore teaching if that was his real passion. Making less money but being happy was worth more than being wealthy and miserable. We talked for 2 hours, the most honest conversation we'd ever had. We weren't close and might never be. But there was potential for a respectful relationship if he continued growing and doing the work. Over the next few months, I noticed Uncle making genuine efforts to change his behavior. He stepped back from financial control of family events and asked other relatives to help plan and host gatherings. This was clearly difficult for him. At Thanksgiving, he suggested that different family members could contribute dishes instead of him catering everything. At Christmas planning, he asked for input instead of just announcing decisions. Other relatives seemed surprised but appreciative. Several mentioned to my parents that they'd felt steamrolled by Uncle's dominance for years, but didn't know how to address it. His effort was noticeable even if it wasn't perfect. He still talked too much and had strong opinions about everything. But he was trying to listen more and control less. Aunt joined a volunteer organization that served low-income families. Mom mentioned this during one of our weekly dinners, and I was immediately skeptical. It felt like Aunt was performing change rather than genuinely growing. But Mom said she'd talked to Aunt a few times, and Rita seemed humbled by the experience. She was working at a food bank distributing groceries to families who couldn't afford enough food. She told Mom that meeting people who worked multiple jobs and still struggled to feed their kids made her realize how lucky she'd been and how blind she'd been to other people's realities. She was learning to see people's worth beyond their economic status. Mom said the change seemed real, but time would tell. I remained cautious but acknowledged that people could grow if they were willing to do the uncomfortable work. 6 months passed since that night at the hotel ballroom, and everything felt different when Grandma sent out invitations for a Sunday gathering at her retirement community. The invitation came from her personally, instead of through Uncle's usual email chain, and she made sure to call Mom directly to confirm they'd be there. When we arrived at the community center, I noticed right away that the seating arrangement had changed completely. Mom and Dad were placed at a central table near the front, instead of being tucked away in some forgotten corner. Uncle and Aunt sat at a side table without any special prominence, and Cousin was nowhere near the head of anything. Multiple relatives had contributed food and decorations, instead of Uncle funding everything and making sure everyone knew about his generosity. The conversations felt genuine instead of competitive, with people actually asking about each other's lives, rather than waiting for their turn to brag about achievements. An older cousin I barely knew approached me during the meal and pulled me aside near the community center windows. She thanked me for what happened at Grandma's birthday party and admitted she'd felt sick watching Uncle and Aunt treat my parents poorly for years. She never knew how to address it without causing a massive family fight, so she just stayed quiet and felt guilty. 3 more relatives said similar things throughout the afternoon, each one sharing that they'd been uncomfortable with the family dynamics, but didn't have the courage or knowledge to disrupt the patterns. A younger cousin told me she'd stopped attending events for 2 years because she couldn't stand watching the way certain family members acted, and my public revelation gave her hope that things might actually change. I realized my moment at the microphone hadn't just been about vindicating my parents or proving my own worth. It gave permission to everyone who'd been silently suffering through the toxic dynamics to finally acknowledge that something was wrong. Grandma stood up before dessert was served and asked for everyone's attention. She thanked everyone for coming and for contributing to make the gathering special. Then she looked directly at my parents. She said she should have acknowledged their decades of hard work and good character years ago, instead of letting her children's competitive nonsense overshadow what really mattered. Dad started tearing up, and Mom squeezed his hand tight while several relatives applauded. I watched my parents receiving the public respect they'd deserved all along, and something heavy lifted from my chest that I didn't even know I'd been carrying. But not everyone seemed comfortable with the new family atmosphere. Uncle and Aunt participated politely, but kept their distance from meaningful conversations, and a few other relatives who'd been deeply invested in the old hierarchy looked uncomfortable throughout the gathering. They attended because family obligation required it, but they didn't engage beyond surface pleasantries. Cousins showed up late and left early, barely making eye contact with anyone. I accepted that not everyone would embrace change or growth. Some people needed the old patterns and hierarchies to feel secure about themselves, and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their behavior was too threatening. They'd rather maintain distance than do the hard work of examining why they participated in cruelty for so many years. That was their choice and their loss. My work at the hospital kept me busy and fulfilled in ways that went beyond clinical medicine. I developed a reputation for mentoring residents who came from backgrounds similar to mine, the ones who felt out of place among colleagues from wealthy families and prestigious universities. Karen stopped by my office one afternoon between shifts and told me I was creating the supportive environment I'd wished for during my own training. She'd watched me spend extra time with a first-year resident who was struggling with imposter syndrome, helping him see that his community college background made him more relatable to certain patients rather than less capable as a physician. I hadn't thought about my mentoring that way, but Karen was right. I was building something better than what I'd experienced, turning my family pain into something that helped others facing similar challenges. Tristan from the hospital board approached me during a department meeting about starting a scholarship program for pre-med students from working-class families. He wanted to use my story as inspiration for fundraising and program development. I agreed immediately because it felt like a way to transform everything I'd been through into something meaningful beyond my own vindication. We spent weeks developing the program structure, identifying students who showed academic promise but lacked financial resources or family support for pursuing medicine. The scholarship would cover tuition and provide mentoring throughout their education, giving them the support system I'd mostly built for myself through sheer determination. During one planning meeting, Tristan mentioned that my family revelation had inspired the board to think differently about diversity in medicine, recognizing that economic background created barriers just as significant as other forms of discrimination. My brother called one evening sounding excited and nervous at the same time. He'd proposed to his longtime girlfriend and she said yes, and he wanted me to be his best man. We met for dinner to celebrate, and during the meal he thanked me for taking the heat from the family for so many years. He explained that my decision to pursue medicine despite their mockery gave him freedom to choose his own path with less pressure. While everyone was focused on whether I'd fail at becoming a doctor, he quietly became an electrician without facing the same level of judgment. I told him I'd never thought about it that way. He said watching me refuse to let the family define my worth taught him that their opinions didn't have to control his choices. He was genuinely happy in his work, and grateful he hadn't let their judgment push him towards some career he didn't want just to prove something. We spent hours talking about our childhood and how we'd both found ways to survive the family dynamics, and I felt closer to him than I had in years. Preparing the best man speech forced me to think deeply about family relationships and what reconciliation actually means. I wrote and rewrote the speech multiple times, trying to capture something honest about how families can be complicated and imperfect. Sometimes the best outcome isn't perfect reconciliation, where everyone becomes close and loving. Sometimes the best you can hope for is honest acknowledgement of harm and genuine effort toward change. Some relatives had grown and were making real efforts to be better. Others remained distant and uncomfortable, unable or unwilling to examine their own behavior. That was okay. I didn't need everyone to transform completely or apologize perfectly. I just needed them to stop actively hurting my parents and to create space for healthier dynamics going forward. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and warm weather. The ceremony was beautiful and included both my parents' modest circle of friends and the extended family, all mixing more naturally than they had in decades. Uncle and Aunt attended and behaved appropriately, sitting quietly through the ceremony and making polite conversation at the reception. There was still some awkwardness when they interacted with my parents, but the atmosphere felt respectful rather than toxic. They didn't try to dominate conversations or make everything about themselves. They brought a generous gift and congratulated my brother sincerely. Cousin showed up alone and stayed on the edges of the reception, and I wondered if he was still processing everything that had changed. Grandma danced with Dad and told him how proud she was of both her grandsons, and several relatives commented on how nice it was to attend a family event that felt warm and genuine instead of competitive and stressful. During my best man speech, I talked about how my brother taught me that success means different things to different people, and the only opinion that matters about your life choices is your own. I watched Mom and Dad holding hands at their table, both of them smiling with real joy instead of the strained politeness they'd worn at family events for decades. The reception went late into the evening with dancing and laughter, and for the first time in my memory, a family gathering felt like an actual celebration instead of a performance or competition. During the reception, Dad found me near the bar getting water and pulled me aside to a quieter corner. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, something between pride and sadness. He told me he was proud of both his sons, one who became a doctor and one who became an electrician, but not because of what we did for work. He said he was proud because we both chose paths that made us happy and refused to let other people's judgments define our worth. He explained that watching my brother ignore the family's pressure to pursue something more prestigious taught him that success meant different things to different people. Then he looked at me and said, watching me disappear for 8 years to build my career without their validation showed him that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is remove yourself from toxic situations until you're ready to face them on your own terms. His voice cracked a little when he said he spent 30 years feeling like a failure because his brother and sister-in-law made him feel that way. But seeing both his sons living authentically made him realize he'd succeeded at the only thing that really mattered. I hugged him hard and felt 8 years of distance between us collapse in that moment. Later, Mom asked me to dance even though neither of us really knew how, and we shuffled awkwardly on the dance floor while she held my hands tight. She told me the last 8 years were hard, watching the family ask if I'd dropped out yet and not being able to tell them the truth. She said there were nights she cried after cleaning office buildings because she missed me at holidays and family dinners, even the terrible ones. But then she smiled and said watching me walk across that hotel ballroom at Grandma's party and claim my achievements in front of everyone who doubted me was one of the best moments of her entire life. She told me she'd endure every condescending comment from Aunt Rita and every dismissive look from Uncle Harold all over again if it meant seeing me become the person I was meant to be. She said the revelation wasn't just about proving them wrong, it was about proving to herself and Dad that they'd raised good sons despite having less money and fewer opportunities than the rest of the family. We kept dancing even after the song ended because neither of us wanted to let go yet. A year after the revelation at Grandma's party, my parents decided to host Thanksgiving at their apartment for the first time in decades. They'd always been invited to other people's houses or excluded entirely, but never hosted themselves. The guest list was small and deliberate. My brother and his wife, me, and a few close family friends who'd supported my parents during all those difficult years when the extended family was cutting them out. Uncle Harold and Aunt Rita weren't invited, not because my parents wanted revenge, but because they were finally prioritizing relationships that felt genuine and nourishing instead of obligatory and painful. Mom spent days cooking her favorite dishes, and Dad set up the small dining table with their nicest plates. The apartment felt warm and full, even though only 7 people were there. One of their friends brought homemade pie, and another brought wine, and everyone talked and laughed without any undertone of competition or judgment. Nobody asked what anyone did for work, or compared salaries or bragged about accomplishments. It was just people who cared about each other sharing a meal together. I helped Dad carve the turkey in the tiny kitchen, while Mom laughed with her friends in the living room about something that happened at her old cleaning job. My brother was showing his wife photos from our childhood and telling stories that made everyone crack up. I watched Dad's face as he carefully sliced the meat and listened to the sounds of genuine happiness filling the apartment. That's when it hit me that the real victory wasn't the dramatic revelation at the hotel or forcing the family to acknowledge my success. The real victory was this moment right here, my parents surrounded by people who genuinely loved them, finally free to enjoy their lives without constantly defending their worth or proving they deserved respect. Our small family unit had become stronger and more connected than ever, not because I became a doctor, but because we all learned that other people's opinions couldn't define us unless we let them. Dad looked up from the turkey and smiled at me, and I knew he understood it too. We carried the food to the table together and sat down with the people who mattered most, and for the first time in my memory, a family gathering felt like coming home instead of going to battle.